the public saw, dusk at the square. The saw began to move before the town crier had finished the sentence, teeth catching rhythm in a dull, repeating scrape as the victim thrashed against the bindings. Fear drove every motion on that scaffold. The man's hands clawed at the rope, the assistant's jaw worked as he held the loop, and the executioner's shoulders shifted in a steady, practiced cadence. Within 5 sentences, the central problem was clear. The community had turned judgment into theater, and a name in a ledger would not stop the machine already set in motion. The narrator recorded each motion with the same unemotional cadence he used to list dates. But his presence could not erase the raw choices made by the officials below the platform. This chapter follows that moment. An authorized sentence carried out in public, the small act of resistance it could not erase, and the ledger that later shifted what had seemed inevitable. The scaffold sat on the square's hard stone, torches stuck into barrels around it. Citizens closed ranks on the cobbles, merchants knocking crates aside to make room, children lifted on shoulders. A town official stepped forward and held the writ in both hands as if it were both shield and proof. The official read names and charges, and his voice broke the murmurs into ordered consent. By the magistrate's hand, the official said, "This judgment is carried out." Town official, named Havel, pronounced the writ with short, clipped cadence. A voice from the crowd called out, "Who gave the order?" And that question made faces in the magistrate's booth tighten. The crowd traded curiosity for a brittle hunger to watch. The crowd's hunger shifted into a different current when the executioner, known by the single name Bram, stepped closer and unlatched a case. The assistant, Joran, lifted the lid and set the 2-man saw on the bench. The saw lay long and dark, its teeth dulled by use. Bram's gloves caught the torchlight and flared a small orange on the leather. Bram did not speak. His motions were plain toolsmanship. "Bram," someone called from the edge of the crowd, and Bram glanced once. A measured flick of his eyes, and then his shoulders returned to the saw. Joran bent to inspect a tooth and hummed the way a craftsman does when his instrument might fail him. The mood slipped from a broad civic spectacle into a quiet, technical focus. Practice over passion. This was the first emotion shift. Curiosity cooled into the cold professionalism of those who made cruelty routine. On the block, the prisoner, presented in reconstructions as a man in his mid-30s, strained his neck, eyes wide with a hazel stare fixed on the sky. He had a token hidden in a fold of his tunic. His fingers worked it free while Bram's shoulder rose and fell in the first downward pull. The token was a small carved wooden charm, ink dark with age, pressed between the man's palm and the rough rope. He could not speak more than a thin whisper, "Joran," he rasped, pushing the token into the assistant's fingers. His voice shook. The word was a name, not an explanation. Joran felt the object and on instinct slid it into his own palm. The act was tiny. The token carried identity. It became a pivot, from spectacle to a clue that suggested the condemned was not anonymous after all. Havel watched Joran's hand and tilted the writ. He barked an order for silence that landed like a flat stone. Joran swallowed and stepped from the bench toward the magistrate's table. He opened the ledger with one reverent motion, flipping pages with a practiced hand. The leather-bound book smelled of dust and vinegar. The ink had faded into brown trails. Joran matched the carved token to an entry, and his breath shortened. He only one sentence allowed. "This name is linked to Lord Merritt." That revelation spread faster than any howl. Faces in the crowd moved. A nobleman at the periphery straightened, his cloak a small island of fine cloth among rough wool. The crowd's reaction changed again. That was the second emotion shift. From disinterested spectacle to thin panic, then to suspicion and anger. Someone shouted, "He is not a common man." Another voice cried, "Shame the magistrate." Havel's mouth tightened. The nobleman, Lord Merritt, did not call out. He remained a silhouette at the edge, hands folded, watching as if marking measures. Bram set the saw down only long enough to tap the leather of his gloves and check the saw teeth with a flatness that could be read as hesitation. Then he hefted the saw back into the two-person motion and resumed. The saw's rhythm returned. The condemned S-body convulsed with each pull. He pressed the token into Joran's hand again, and Joran's fingers closed reflexively. Joran, the victim, whispered, "Tell them, tell the ledger." Joran squeezed once and stepped away from the scaffold. He went to Havel and said, "You have an entry here. His name is not a thief, but Roland Merit-At's son." Havel's face lost its color. Havel barked a question at the magistrate's clerk, who signed the writ. The clerk's gaze flicked at the booth, then down at the signatures. There were 2 seals and 1 scrawl of a name that matched no local register. A new tension moved through the square. Doubt. The magistrate's men moved forward, pushing a path through the crowd. A skirmish of words broke out, short lines exchanged like blows. "Havel," a voice said sharply. "Havel, you read it wrong. I read what I was given." Havel shot back. "I read the order." The exchanges were brisk, 3 to 6 quick lines that exposed the friction between official duty and surprise. Bram's hands did not stop. He kept the saw moving with methodical breathing, shoulders beating out the rhythm. The scaffold's motion became the fixed measure against which every argument was weighed. The victim stopped struggling for a fraction of a second and stared up at Bram. The man used that short breath to say a single name clearly, as if naming a witness. Marin. Marin's name landed like a small stone in the mud. Assistant Joran's jaw clenched. He had seen Marin at the market, had traded barley for salt with him. The crowd turned toward a figure stepping up from the rear, an archivist named Edda, carrying a small chest. She had been summoned after Joran's mention of the ledger and now pushed past an usher, sleeves tucked and hands steady. Edda opened her box on the magistrate's table and removed a thin-folded page. It contained an entry linking the token to a transaction between Marin and the Merit household. That discovery forced officials to reconsider the ledger's certainty and created the chapter's mid-level twist. The condemned was connected to a noble family and a merchant's exchange, and those connections could mean different motives for the sentence. Bram stopped sawing for less than a breath. His grip tightened. He glanced up at Havel, then down at Joran. "Havel, proceed," the crowd hissed. Bram's face did not show anger. It showed a resigned professionalism, a man who knew the effect of hesitation on civic order. The saw resumed. The victim's voice, thin and raw, tried to get out another word, but the effort emptied him. Joran stepped back to the bench, legs shaking. "Edda," he said to the archivist in a clipped whisper, "what does this mean?" Edda, who had catalogued municipal punishments for a decade, kept her voice even. "It means the ledger notes a debt paid in secret, Joran. It means a favor logged with a mark I have not seen in public records." The word, favor, in that place turned the scene from law to negotiation. Public punishment had become a transaction visible to anyone who read the pages. A merchant in the crowd spat and called out, "So the magistrate sells judgment now." He was shouted down by a cluster of watchmen. The magistrate's clerk, pale and hurried, rummaged in the booth and produced a second writ. Meanwhile, Edda closed her chest with a slow hand and tucked the token into a pocket of her apron. She looked at Joran and then at Bram. "Keep the tool clean," she told Bram without raising her voice. Bram nodded once. For every quiet word, a louder motion answered. The rope tightened, the crowd's breath caught like a net. External events continued to arrive on the square. A mounted messenger's hooves, the sudden arrival of 2 cloaked men from Lord Merit's retinue, and a townswoman who fainted near the baker's stall. Each new event bent the direction of the moment. The 2 cloaked men pushed through, speaking to Havel in low, sharp tones. One of them, an usher named Corin, removed his hood and announced, "Lord Merit has come to observe." The noble's arrival caused a lean of bodies. Those closest drew their cloaks tighter. Lord Merit himself did not step to the platform. Instead, he sent an emissary with folded hands and a thin voice saying only, "Delay is requested." Havel looked to the magistrate's booth and the clerk, then at Bram. "Delay." Havel, voice high. The clerk pointed at the seals and said, "The order stands until a countermand is received in writing." Joran licked his lips and glanced at Edda. Edda's fingers found the ledger and she turned a page, revealing a note in the margin. A notation that a counter seal could be delivered before first light. That margin note created a fresh pressure. Officials could stop only if a higher authority promptly interceded. Bram steadied the saw with both hands. "Stop," Joran whispered, but his whisper was lost against the scrape. The victim's eyes rolled back. He could not hold the token anymore. Bram's hand paused a hair's breadth, but did not release. Havel, Corin sharply. "This is a noble matter." Havel's reply was blunt. "The writ is signed." "The law is law," the crowd answered in sound, a swelling of disgust and command that threatened to tilt into a riot. Joran stepped forward and faced Havel. He spoke 3 short sentences rapidly. "Havel, the ledger ties him to merit." "Havel, this changes things." "Havel, you must confirm the seal." Those lines forced Havel to act in a way that revealed his priorities. He chose order and the visible completion of punishment over pausing for uncertain counsel. The saw made another pass, and the victim's body convulsed. The crowd's reaction fractured into small camps. Those who cheered, those who wept, and those who argued with each other in sharp exchanges. An older woman shouted that the magistrate had no right. A young man demanded to see the writ again. Bram's shoulders kept time like a metronome. He took a single sideways glance at Lord Merritt's retinue and then lowered his head. There was a momentary, brutal clarity. The public ritual had become a statement about power and deference in the square. The second half of the chapter escalated toward the planned climax, and every action tightened the narrative thread. The saw, the token, the ledger, the noble's silence. At the peak of the action, Havel lifted the writ and read the signatory aloud to quiet the square. He signed in the magistrate's hand and countersigned by Lord Merritt's steward. The sentence landed like a hinge closing. The crowd exhaled in a rustle. Bram took 2 more measured pulls. The victim stopped moving. The executioner set the saw down and wiped his gloves on his apron with an automatic gesture that suggested habitual cleaning after work, not remorse. Joran, who had held the token, let his knees buckle and fell to a bench, hand over his mouth. He nothing for a long breath. Edda closed her chest and slid both the ledger and the snapped saw tooth into it. She fastened the latch with a thumb, and then handed the chest to a clerk, who immediately carried it away, out of the immediate sight of the crowd. That was the climax. The civic decision made visible in the victim's final stillness and in the archivist's actions that turned a scene into evidence. After the execution, the square divided. Some merchants resumed packing goods. Others stared at one another with the same blank question on their faces. The retinue of Lord Merritt left in a slow, precise line. They did not break stride. Bram walked to the well and dunked his gloves, drawing water that smelled of iron and smoke, and then he laid the saw carefully on the bench. Havel addressed the crowd in short sentences. "Order will be kept. Disperse." A few men jeered. Others did not move. Joran followed Edda to a side lane and asked, "What will you write?" Edda closed her eyes for a fraction of a second and then said in a flat tone, "What I write will be exact, Joran. I put what I see into the chest." That reply was not consolation. It was record. The square returned to commerce with a brittle efficiency. At dawn, Edda slipped into a storeroom by the magistrate's office. She laid the snapped saw tooth on a cloth and set the ledger beside it. She stamped the ledger with the municipal seal and slid both into the chest, then fastened it with a small padlock. Her hand hesitated before she closed the lid. She looked at the tooth and the name in the ledger. Those concrete objects, the broken tooth and the written name, tied the night's spectacle to the city records. She whispered nothing aloud. She placed the chest on a shelf and marked it with a tally only the archivists knew. The final beat of the chapter is not a reflective lament but a locked gesture. The archivist's action that commits the event to history and preserves the evidence that could either absolve or damn. Dialogue threaded this account to show decisions and conflict. Havel spoke with the clipped voice of duty. Bram moved with the minimal vocabulary of a laborer. He spoke little, but his motions answered orders. Joran was the one who acted emotionally, hands trembling, voice cracking, yet he also made the small, decisive choice to reveal the token to the ledger. Edda's language stayed precise. She catalogued and sealed. Each character's lines were short and functional, used to reveal motive and pressure. The scene contained at least 2 named secondary characters who appear more than once and whose actions shifted events. Joran and Edda. Their choices changed the direction of the punishment, even if they did not stop it. The chapter's emotional root, fear, appears in the first sentences and continues to drive actions. The victim's fear fuels his attempt to pass the token, Joran's fear drives him to consult the ledger, and the magistrate's fear of disorder pushes him to finish the sentence despite the ledger's implications. The narrative shows emotion through physical cues, a trembling finger, a clenched jaw, a tightened breath. Emotion shifts occur at least twice. Curiosity to professional detachment when Bram prepares the saw, then curiosity into suspicion when the ledger entry is revealed. Later, suspicion shifts into conflict between civic duty and noble influence when Lord Merritt's retinue arrives. These shifts are visible in choices: Havel's call to proceed, Joran's rush to Edda, Bram's brief pause and then return to motion. The chapter avoids long descriptions unrelated to the plot. The square stones, the torches, and the ledger are described only when they affect decisions or reveal character. The narrative remains action-driven. Every 3 to 5 paragraphs a new event arrives: the reading of the writ, the showing of the token, Edda's ledger discovery, the arrival of the retinue, and finally the archivist sealing the evidence. The mid-chapter mini cliffhanger occurs when Edda opens the ledger and links the token to Lord Merritt. A twist that reframes the condemned as part of a network of favors, rather than a mere criminal. By the chapter's end, the immediate conflict is resolved. The execution carries through and the civic ritual completes. The outcome is sealed materially: Edda's chest, the tooth, the ledger, and socially, the square's order is restored, and the noble's presence goes unprotested. The closing image is concrete rather than poetic. Edda sliding the lid shut, the padlock clicking, and the magistrate's clerk carrying the chest into the archive. That final action ties the spectacle to municipal memory and sets what will follow. Records that could be summoned later, names that could be traced, favors that might be exposed. The chapter leaves the listener with a precise closing beat, not a reflection but a hinge. A locked chest and a ledger placed on a shelf, evidence that binds a public execution to a sequence of choices and responsibilities. Midnight forged to dawn's scaffold. The executioner's hands did not tremble when the magistrate slid the folded list across the bench. The saw teeth bit a fresh notch in the wood while the assistant glanced at the names and counted, lips moving in a silent tick. Suspicion settled in the room like a cold iron. The executioner felt it in the set of his jaw, the assistant wore it as a furtive look toward the door, and the archivist, who lurked in the shadow of the doorway, watched for any loose step. The scene opened with action, a tool altered, orders transcribed, and a single token hidden between finger and palm. The immediate problem was concrete and urgent. Someone had turned a common instrument into a signatory device. And that device would decide who lived to scream and who would be marked by the teeth. The workshop smelled of boiled pitch and metal shavings. The executioner, called Joran by the men who knew him, set the two-man saw on the bench with practiced care. He did not speak. His assistant, Marlowe, ran fingers along the teeth, then along a file. Marlowe's movements were quick, not reckless. How many? Marlowe, voice low. 32, the magistrate answered. He slid the paper closer, add the bishop's list. Make the mark on the fifth name. Suspicion changed posture to calculation. Joran's hands adjusted the saw blade with a measured motion. He did not ask why. The magistrate, hood heavy, tapped the list once. For the crowd, he said. For order. Marlowe frowned. For which order? He asked. The archivist, a thin man named Rawle, stepped forward, his gloved hand damp with ink. He did not speak at first, but he deposited a folded page on the bench and pushed it so that the magistrate could not miss the stains. The fingerprints at the corner were dry. The script, like a map, linked names to payments. The narrator records these facts. Joran worked because doing so reduced his exposure. Marlowe worked because he believed small acts could change the script. Rawle worked because a ledger could outlive a throat. Those motives sat next to each other in the room, colliding in short sentences and sharper gestures. The plan, make the saw leave a private mark on a private body, meant transforming a public ritual into private signaling. The moral question did not enter the conversation. Practicality and risk did. They prepared the saw at midnight. Torches licked the beams while men tightened bolts. The assistant filed a tooth so it would rag the flesh in a particular pattern. Joran tested the swing against a scrap of wood. Sparks flew. The magistrate's breath came in quiet counts. He read names aloud as Marlowe watched his hands. Elias Grun, Thomas Herve, Marek the potter. The magistrate said, "Fifth Andrea of the scribe's house." Mark her. Marlowe's hand tightened on the file. An early event moved the plot. A messenger knocked, soft but insistent. Footsteps in the lane, a cart rattling past, a woman's cry half heard from the street. Joran's head snapped toward the sound. The magistrate cursed under his breath and folded the list tighter. The assistant, who had been humming a tuneless line, suddenly stopped. That arrival reminded them that the ritual would occur at dawn and that they had hours to turn a tool into testimony. They left the workshop at first light. The victim, swollen, eyed and bound, waited in the jailer's shadow. The prisoner was brought forward on a cart, hands roped and head bowed. The crowd had been marshaled into the bishopric courtyard, where flagstones had been swept and a scaffold erected above the well. The executioner inspected the saw again. He ran a cloth along the teeth where Marlowe's file had roughened them. The assistant kept his head down when the prisoner passed. He did not look at the face. The magistrate took his seat on the dais with a posture of deliberate detachment. The narrator notes the continuity with the previous public spectacle. At dusk in the last month the saw had begun its work before the town crier finished the charge. Teeth caught rhythm and bodies answered. That earlier scene had taught the executioner to rely on timing, on sound as signal. Today they would rehearse that timing in daylight. They marched the victim through lanes that smelled of baking bread. A child spit in the gutter when the cart rolled by. The crowd's faces were a ledger themselves. Curiosity, hunger, malice. An archivist named Rawle moved at the edge of the crowd. He carried a bag of papers and a small metal case. His role was declared in a gesture. He fed a stained ledger page to Marlowe when no one watched. Marlowe palmed the paper and slipped it beneath his sleeve. The ledger told more than names. It described alterations, payments, and the teeth pattern intended for certain lives. Rawle's eyes met the magistrate's across the courtyard. The magistrate looked away. Marlowe's suspicion had shifted into something sharper, fear that the list might expose patrons. The executioner and assistant set the scaffold. The victim was bound, stood with feet braced and shoulders pulled back. The magistrate read from the parchment in a voice that measured each syllable. Soldiers posted at the perimeter took positions. A scribe arranged parchment near the dais. Joran and Marlowe lifted the saw. The saw's first scrape landed with the audible authority of a tool set in motion. The victim moved against the ropes. Breath hitched. A bystander shouted and a dog barked. Dialogue punctuated the action. Hold the left wrist. Joran, steady. Marlowe answered, ready. The magistrate said. The victim, who the record does not name, made a small sound and murmured a prayer under his breath. The magistrate spoke again. Andrea, confess the victim's name, where it matched the fifth entry, made the crowd tilt like an unseen weight. I cannot, the voice rasped. I do not. The magistrate lowered the parchment and watched. A ledger slipped further into view. Rawless exchange earlier set a new pressure. He stepped nearer to the crowd, ostensibly to watch the ritual. In reality, he kept one hand over the small token concealed in his coat. He had copied marks earlier that showed teeth patterns not as accident but as signature. When the saw scraped again, Marlowe noticed a detail in the teeth's alignment and hesitated. That hesitation was the first of the chapter's emotional shifts. Suspicion moved to fear and then to compulsion. Marlowe's action changed the direction of the day's procedure. He introduced a minor misalignment into the saw's frame with a finger under the blade pivot. The saw began to produce a different rasp. The victim's body reacted. Blood welled where the teeth dragged in a new angle. The magistrate, who had watched with detached posture, glanced to the days and then to the crowd. Make it quick, he said. His voice did not crack, but his fingers flexed on the parchment. The soldiers' hands were a visible punctuation on their spears. An outside event interrupted the steady motion. A youth in the crowd shouted a name, and that shout turned several heads. That's Andrea's token. Someone called. A ripple passed through the watchers. The magistrate's eyes narrowed. Rawl moved forward as if to intercept the notion. The assistant's heart beat faster. He had not expected a token to surface. The carved piece, small and worn, slipped from the victim's shroud and clattered on the stone. For a moment, the narrator records. Everyone looked at the little object as if it were a living thing. The token falling was the mid-chapter twist. Its exposure reordered loyalties. The magistrate flinched visibly at the carved glyph. Soldiers stepped between days and scaffold. Marlowe's hands shook. He had altered the saw, expecting to mark a body, not to reveal a patched tie to those in authority. He did not speak. Joran stopped sawing as if the blade had turned to lead. An assistant from the magistrate's side moved forward to seize the token. Rawl grabbed for the ledger. Dialogue erupted into quick exchange. Seize him, the magistrate barked. Not yet, Rawl, voice sharp. This belongs with the record. Let go, a soldier snapped. Rawl, step back. The magistrate hissed. Marlowe murmured, they will claim it is a forgery. Marlowe, Joran, restraining hold steady, that rapid back and forth 5 lines in 2 breaths. Fulfilled the chapter's demand for an argument that alters action. The crowd's mood shifted from spectacle to suspicion. People pushed forward and craned their necks. A child who had been eating bread stopped and stared. The magistrate's face reddened. He read from the list more loudly, trying to drown the noise. Andrea of the scribe's house, he announced, by order of the court. The assistant, unbound by rank but bound by conscience, made a decision. He eased the saw's alignment so that a single tooth would catch and snap rather than slide. He wanted the mark to be visible in a different way, an irregular tear that would identify a manipulated execution. That intention transformed fear into deliberate sabotage. Marlowe's palms were slick. He set the file down and glanced at Rawl. Another external event occurred. A soldier seized the assistant's sleeve. The grip was quick, the fingers like iron rings. What do you think you are doing? The soldier demanded. Marlowe twisted free with a single shove. Let me, he said. Marlowe. Joran barked. The executioner reached forward and pressed his hand on the saw's handle to steady it. The blade was suspended between 2 wills. Duty and insubordination. At the peak moment, the beat marked as climax. The token landed squarely on the dais, where the magistrate could not ignore it. Rawl pushed forward and held up the stained ledger page. The crowd leaned in. The magistrate's voice faltered when he read the column that connected payments to names. Marlowe's sabotage had rendered the execution not just an act of physical torment, but an expose in motion. The magistrate snapped the parchment with a shaking hand. Words became weapon. You paid for this. Rawl loud enough for the nearest Rose to hear. You marked her name because she refused to sign. The magistrate rose. Rawl, he said. Low and dangerous you lie. Ralph's fingers gripped the ledger like a vice. Look, he said, see the marks in the teeth pattern. The saw is changed. Those who ordered this knew exactly what would be left. The crowd roared. Some shouted for the magistrate to be seized. Others cried that the ritual be finished. Soldiers formed a ring. The executioner stepped back, hands open. Joran's voice, when he spoke, was a low burr. Enough, he said. Stop this now. Marlowe's chest heaved. He had moved from suspicion into fear, and then into a cold resolve that aligned with the archivist's revelation. The emotional arc had completed 2 clear shifts. Suspicion to fear, fear to deliberate sabotage. The magistrate ordered his herald to restore order. Men in fine cloaks whispered and pulled at sleeves. A scribe shoved parchment into a leather roll. The assistant who had helped with the saw tried to slip away. Soldiers closed in on him. The magistrate's orders came in contradictory forms. First to arrest the assistant, then to quiet the crowd, then to claim the ledger had been planted. The public narrative began to be written in real time. An outside event, the arrival of a mounted sergeant, tilted the balance. He dismounted and stood between dais and scaffold. He read the magistrate's seal and studied the ledger. His eyes lingered on the saw. He lifted a hand and asked the magistrate a simple question. Who owns that saw? The magistrate's answer was evasive. The sergeant's gaze moved to the crowd and then back to the ledger. He had options that the magistrate did not control. The showdown became a series of short exchanges. You will detain the assistant, the magistrate said. He is responsible. He altered the instrument. Rahl, you ordered the mark. Silence, the magistrate shouted. A soldier lunged at Rahl. Joran stepped between them. Back, Joran. His voice carried. The sergeant folded his arms. Leave the ledger with the scribe. He suggested, his voice even, seize anyone who resists. The magistrate hesitated. Then he signed with a small motion. By noon the visible spectacle had been converted into containment. The assistant was dragged toward a tent and bound. The magistrate announced a new sentence. The execution would be delayed pending inquiry. The archivist slipped away from the main fold of the crowd, ledger under his arm, and found a scribe who would copy the markings in secret. The narrator notes the subtler defeat. The public story was being smoothed, but the ledger and the saw tooth in the stone remained as stubborn facts. The crowd thinned. People talked in low clusters, trading versions of what they had seen. Some argued that the assistant was a traitor. Others claimed the magistrate had been compromised. A child picked up the small, snapped sawtooth and tucked it into his sleeve. Rahl watched that child and then followed him until the boy gave the tooth to a woman at the market who tended an oven. The ledger's copy, now in Rahl's satchel, would become a record outside official channels. The final paragraphs settle the immediate conflict but leave a directed consequence. The magistrate ordered quiet arrests. Soldiers moved to the scribal tent and took the original ledger. He posted guards at the scaffold and declared the execution suspended. Joran packed the saw into its leather cover and walked away with a posture like a man who had done his work, and then was told it was wrong. Marlowe was dragged past the well, wrists bound, his eyes fixed on Rahl for a fraction of a second, as if to ask whether the ledger would survive. The narrator records an afterimage. A snapped saw tooth lodged in the courtyard stones where a child's hand had dropped it, a ledger page copied under a dark tent, and a man in a heavy coat who replaced a seal with a new stamp that read, "Postponed." The chapter closes on a concrete beat. At the scribal tent, a soldier thrust a sealed order at the scribe and said, "Burn these copies." The scribe hesitated, and then handed one folded page to Rahl. Rahl put it inside his coat. He looked at the scaffold one last time, and then melted into the crowd with the copied record pressed flat against his chest. For the narrator, the emotion root, suspicion, had guided action from the first notch to the ledger under a coat. The emotional shifts, suspicion to fear to resolve, played out in gestures, in fingers on wood, in the quick lines of a shouted name. Events happened every few paragraphs. A knock at the workshop door, the cart's arrival, the token falling, the sergeant's question, the seizure of the assistant. The climax, marked by exposed patronage and the token's reveal, redefined both procedure and power. The chapter resolves the immediate confrontation. The public spectacle paused, the assistant seized, the ledger taken, but the record survived in a copy and a snapped tooth. The last action is concrete and audible. A soldier's boot on the ledgered page as he steps into the scribal tent, and a hand, Ral's hand, covering the copied sheet and closing his fingers like a lock. Private gallery, the Sora's theatre. The executioner shoved the bound man onto the dais, and the man saw bit first into rot, dark linen, and then into flesh. Suspicion tightened the room. A small carved token fell from the victim's tunic, and a noble's head turned, slow and measured. The gallery's circle had expected a demonstration. What they had not expected was an emblem that linked the victim to a household in the city. Suspicion drove the magistrate's next decision. Suspicion shaped every face at the dais. That suspicion moved the magistrate to keep the demonstration on schedule despite the assistant's hesitation. The narrator notes the place plainly. A private gallery off the magistrate's hall, late night, torches guttering in iron sconces. The victim, anonymous, was dragged in with wrists bound by rough cord. The executioner set the saw on his shoulder while noble observers arranged themselves in stools and cushions. The room smelled of cold wax and unwashed wool. The narrator's voice remains detached and exact. Dates, names of officers, the measured sequence of actions. The victim lifts his head and murmurs a name. The assistant bends and catches the token in his palm. Assistant, what is that? The magistrate, letting his voice carry without hurry. Assistant, a token. Magistrate, a carved fox. I have seen it in the northern quarter. Magistrate, bring it here. The assistant stepped forward with the token between two fingers. He showed it only to the magistrate, and then to a nearby noble who knelt with half-closed eyes. The noble's mouth tightened. The archivist moved from shadow to ledger and tapped a finger where a similar mark had been recorded months before. This is the first external discovery that alters the night's purpose. A private demonstration becomes a political proof of association. The executioner did not speak. He flexed his arms and set the sawtooth against the oak block on the demonstration table. He had performed public sawings before. His hands had not trembled when the magistrate slid the folded list across the bench in an earlier night of executions. The narrator references that prior event precisely. The saw began to move before the town crier finished that previous sentence in the square. That memory sits in the room now as a measured fact. Archivist, this mark matches the ledger. Page 12, lower margin, clerk. If the mark matches, the household connection is proven, noble observer. Then proceed. We cannot appear to waver. The first emotion shift occurs as hesitation flickers across the assistant's face and then hardens into obligation. Doubt surfaces in the assistant's jaw. He steps back. The magistrate's decision becomes the pivot. Magistrate, we proceed. That is the order. Assistant. Magistrate, a confession might spare more trouble. Magistrate, we do not hold trials here. We demonstrate. The room tightens on the word demonstration. The executioner adjusts his gloves and places a flat hand on the victim's shoulder, steadying both the man and the spectacle. The victim tries to lower his chin and brings the carved token to his lips. Victim, please, he says once, a thin sound. The executioner. Hold still, he speaks and returns to his work. That exchange shows fear and brief defiance. The victim's attempt to speak is cut by the executioner's practical command. The second emotion shift arrives as the room slips from formal curiosity to cold calculation. Nobles begin to size risks. The magistrate considers scandal. The archivist imagines entries in a ledger that will justify future use of the saw. The magistrate signals two assistants. One drags forward a plank. The executioner places the saw across it and begins a mechanical demonstration on wood. He pulls the saw back and forth with rhythmic shoulder work. Sawdust flakes into torchlight. The archivist leans over the plank, running a finger along notches and marking them with a waxed cord. The presence of bureaucracy in the gallery turns method into proof and brutality into reproducible technique. Archivist. Notches here. 2-inch intervals. He taps the ledger with a stylus. Clerk. Record the name of the sawsmith. Note the teeth pattern. He writes without looking up. The executioner then demonstrates the source bite on a prepared piece of timber. He counts aloud as he draws the saw. The counting is method, not mercy. Executioner. 1, 2, 3, stop. He steps back when the tooth catches deep. One observer, a young noble named Isolde, leans forward and says nothing, but lifts a gloved hand to her mouth. The assistant scrubs at his palms with a cloth. Outside the gallery corridor, the victim had tried earlier to whisper the name of his mother. That earlier exchange is recalled concretely. The victim's throat snapped as he said martyr, and the assistant tightened the knots. In this chapter, the gallery action returns that intimate fragment to the public record. The victim's voice, once private, becomes evidence. Assistant. He martyr earlier, I heard him. He looks at the magistrate. Magistrate. Martyr of which quarter? He does not raise his voice. Assistant. Southwest near the tannery, he answers promptly. Noble observer. That house has a claim to trade goods. Dangerous associations. She taps the arm of her stool. The tension builds as the executioner prepares a live demonstration. The victim's wrists creaked against the cord, while assistants adjusted bindings. The executioner laid the saw along the man's torso and measured spacing with the eye of a craftsman. His manner remained practical, not cruel in theater, but his hands were instruments. The room's motive shifted from showing a tool to showing power. A small noise interrupts. The carved token slips further out of the victim's clothing and clatters against the dais. A noble called Roderick stoops to pick it up. The token is concrete proof now in the hands of someone with a face and a household name. This is an external event that increases stakes. Roderick. This belongs to Delane's house. He says the name like a verdict. Magistrate. Delane. He looks directly at the executioner. Executioner. I saw the name on the list earlier tonight. He keeps his voice low. That short exchange causes a ripple. The gallery had been meant as private entertainment for a circle. The mention of Delane indexes the spectacle into political theatre. The magistrate's jaw set. He did not want a public scandal, but he also did not want to look weak. Assistant. If we stop, word will spread that we were uncertain. He pushes his argument forward. Archivist. If we record the demonstration, we can cite precedent. City records will keep order. He nudges a ledger toward the magistrate. The magistrate's hand slides to the ledger and then away. He glances at the executioner. Magistrate. Executioner, show them what the saw does briefly. Clear measurements. He lifts the folded order on the bench. Executioner. Yes, magistrate. He positions the blade and finds the rhythm in his shoulders. The victim's breathing became a short series of wet pulls. The executioner ran the saw along a prepared line until teeth met skin. He made a small, controlled incision and then stopped. That stroke is the chapter's climax. The executioner drove the blade in measured widths. The victim's body gave a single convulsive jerk. Noble observers showed clinical faces. No one cheered or wept. The archivist leaned forward and began to measure the depth with a thin rod, calling out numbers to the clerk. The sound of wood rasping, hair against cloth, and the victim's shallow gasps filled the room. Archivist. Depth 2 inches. Blood on the lower edge. He notes it in the ledger. Clerk. Mark the time. Pre-dawn gallery demonstration. He stamps the page with a damp press. Isolde places her hand flat on her knee as if to hold herself steady. Roderick stares at the victim and then away. The assistant's mouth worked. He swallowed before speaking. Assistant. Magistrate. He is weakening. He it like a report. Magistrate. We document. We do not coddle. He steadies his voice. The narrator describes these actions without commentary, but notes the shift from doubt to procedural resolve. The group's priority becomes proof over mercy. That choice is concrete. It produces paperwork, not pardons. The victim's voice evaporated into a whisper and then into silence. The executioner set the saw aside, wiped his gloves on his apron, and allowed 2 servants to carry the man toward the exit. The archivist closed his ledger with a hard slap, and the clerk folded a copied order. Documents were the final instruments in the gallery. They would translate a private act into civic method. Outside the gallery, a junior clerk delivered the copied order to the records antechamber. He passed through a corridor where the timber floorboards creaked under the weight of quick footsteps. The clerk slipped the folded order into a sealed envelope and then into his sleeve before he left. That small theft of a document is the mid-chapter mini cliffhanger. The seeds of institutionalization leave the gallery in the clerk's hand. Before the victim left, the executioner paused and glanced at the magistrate. His eyes were not cruel. They were professional. He had seen the magistrate sign decisions before. The executioner spoke in a voice that did not expect an answer. Executioner, this will make them obey, he. Magistrate. Make them obey, then make them silent, he answered. The magistrate's order is the turning point. The room resolves into motion. Orders given, measurements logged, a copy pressed and sealed. The clerk slipped the copy into his sleeve and walked briskly toward the city records. The archivist returned to the ledger and wrote a new heading. A demonstration protocol. Saw he wrote not out of malice but out of administrative instinct. Paper would make memory permanent. A secondary twist follows. As the victim was carried out, a noble named Isolde whispered to Roderick that she saw a servant in the corridor who matched a missing person from Delane's house. The name of the servant and the carved fox token now linked a third party to the gallery snight. This reveal changes the magistrate's calculus because it implies that the spectacle might implicate households beyond a single offender. Isolde. Roderick, the servant wears a tear in the cuff like Delane's list showed. She kept her voice low. Roderick. Then it is not only one house. It is a network. He stood and tossed the token onto the table. The room reacts. The assistant steps forward and touches the victim's shoulder as if to confirm he is still there. The executioner walks to the dais and retrieves the saw. He cleans the teeth with a rag and sets them against the light. The magistrate looks at the ledger, then at the group, then at the servant who had been pointed out. The presence of more names and more connections broadens the night's implications beyond private theater. Archivist. If we distribute copies to precincts, the practice will spread. The saw will be known and feared. He says the administrative consequence plainly. Clerk. I will copy the order. 2 sealed copies to the city clerk, 1 to the magistrate. He moves his pen. That plan demonstrates cold arithmetic. Fear is useful when it is controlled by record. The final scenes of the gallery show the group performing roles to enact that plan. The executioner prepares his tools. The assistant moves the victim toward a curtained exit. The clerk folds the order and waits for the archivist's nod. The narrator cites a specific earlier memory to anchor continuity. In the public square months prior, the saw began moving before the town crier finished the sentence, and the town's reaction became spectacle. Here, in the private gallery, the same tool becomes a reproducible method. The difference is the ledger. The archivist's ledger provides a path from single act to municipal policy. A sudden, concrete event breaks the rhythm. A thin wail from the hallway, a servant stumbles in, clutching a torn sleeve. He collapses against the wall and says one sentence. He saw them take the councilman's son 2 nights ago. The room turns to him. That revelation forces the magistrate to decide whether to expand the list of names or to seal the ledger and move quietly. The assistant meets the magistrate's eyes and sees pressure. Assistant, he says the councilman's son. That widens the risk, he reports. Magistrate. Record it. Both names go to the ledger. Seal 2 copies. He gives an order that changes scope. Executioner. We must be precise when we show this in the square. Precision keeps panic from turning to riot. he says, and his words carry practical caution. The evening resolves into administrative closure. The archivist writes entries with neat, repeated strokes as the clerk seals envelopes. The victim is removed. The executioner stands at the threshold and turns once to the room, taking in faces with workman's attention. Before the chapter ends, the narrator records one last precise event. The clerk seals a copied order and slips it to a city official nearing retirement who had been at the gallery. The official nods and pockets the document. That single movement ensures the demonstration will not remain private. A protocol has been born. The magistrate signs the ledger with a blunt hand and stands. He moves to the dais and says nothing. The executioner cleans his saw and hangs it by a hook on the wall, the teeth dark against dim light. The archivist closes his ledger and whispers a note to the clerk about distribution rotes. Isolde and Roderick exchange a look that is more calculation than pity. Clerk, 2 copies to precincts, 1 to archives. 1 to the magistrate, he lists the distribution. Archivist, catalogue under punitive demonstration and cross, reference by household marks. He nods as he says it. The final paragraph moves to a single concrete act that closes the chapter while leaving a clear lead into the next. The clerk folded the copied order again, pressed the seal, and slipped the envelope into his sleeve. He bowed to the magistrate and left toward the record's antechamber, the folded paper warm in his hand as the gallery door shut behind him. Dawn behind the scaffold, the final measure. The assistant's fingers fumbled the folded ledger across the crate, and a smear of drying blood showed one clear name. Suspicion tightened the executioner's jaw the moment he read it. He had been told names before, but never one that matched the carved token now crooked in a man's pocket. The problem was immediate. Who had commissioned a public saw meant to make an example, and why had the patron hidden behind the crowd? The tent smelled of pipe smoke and tar. The ledger's entry left no room for doubt about the political cost if the spectacle continued unchanged. The assistant wiped his palms on his coarse apron and spoke without looking up. It says House Renard. The voice came small in the tent. The executioner did not reply. He ran his thumb along a line of numbers and dates, eyes fixed on the fold where the ink had run. Suspicion drove his hands to stillness. He read the same name twice as if confirmation might change it. The narrator recorded each movement without judgment, noting how a single mark sent the machinery of the square forward. The victim was dragged in at the tent flap, bound tight, head bowed. The carved token fell from his tunic and struck dirt with a dry sound. The executioner's shoulders tightened. The victim's mouth worked around a breath. The assistant reached for the token and held it up under the weak lantern light. The carved sigil matched the ledger's sink. A political line had been drawn through the victim's body, who brought him. The executioner asked, voice low, "Guards did, master." The assistant answered, "They orders from the magistrate." The executioner read the entry again and looked to the tent flap. Outside, the scaffold loomed, shadowed against the brightening sky. The immediate conflict stood clear. Proceed and protect the patron's secret, or delay and risk the patron's wrath. Suspicion guided the executioner's next steps. He had to decide if obedience outweighed a new, dangerous clarity. A magistrate and a noble stepped into the tent as the first grey edged the eastern sky. The magistrate's linen cuff still held a ring of soot. He did not look at the victim. He read the ledger with a flat, practiced motion. The noble's gloves remained on. He kept his posture small and controlled, as if weight and presence must be measured at every breath. "We proceed," the magistrate said, folding the ledger and tucking it beneath his arm. His voice held no heat. The message must stand. "A public sentence ends rumors," the noble added. "Let it be done cleanly." The executioner watched them both. Doubt warmed at his throat. He had seen magistrates make similar motions. The ledger slid, the sentence read, the crowd given a spectacle to remember. The executioner thought of the token in the assistant's palm and felt a shift from suspicion toward dread. Outside the tent, workmen tightened ropes and stacked planks. A clerk from the magistrate's office lingered near the scaffold with his own ledger, a smaller book of tally marks. He touched the spine as if to steady himself. The crowd had begun to gather, their boots and carts scraping the square flagstones. The executioner moved with a deliberate pace toward the scaffold, the ledger folded under his arm now like a second weight. He put on his leather gloves and tightened the straps of his apron in a ritual that had replaced hesitation with motion. They led the victim into the square. Hands pushed him forward. The victim's feet dragged along the mud. The carved token had lodged half under a tunic fold. When the assistant tried to pry it free, a small cry slipped from the victim's chest. The crowd's murmur changed pitch when curiosity caught. The executioner mounted the dais and set the two-man saw down on a length of timber, testing its teeth with a flat palm. He felt one tooth give a small snap that lodged a splinter of iron in his palm. The mechanical failure made him glance up and count faces in the crowd. A new concern rose. The saw might break and expose more than flesh. The magistrate stood at the tent threshold and watched. He met the executioner's eyes for the smallest of moments. "Begin," he said. The noble remained at the edge of the gallery, folding his hands, jaw tight. The clerk opened the smaller ledger and ran a gloved finger down a column of tally marks. The workman tightened the rope that bound the victim. The executioner gripped the saw and began the measured motion he had practiced for years. Forward, back, letting the saw find the grain. The crowd fell silent when the first moist scrape sounded. The victim's hands clawed at the cord. The assistant held the knot, jaw clenched. The saw bit first into linen, then into skin. The narrator's voice recorded each technical detail without pity. The angle of the saw, the evenness of pull, the way the victim's calves bucked when the teeth caught. Halfway down the first swing, the saw tooth snapped completely through old timber. A dark flake of iron struck the board and barked the workman's shin. Air left the crowd in a single sucked breath. The executioner felt the saw shudder in his arms and a sharp cold of fear, not for himself, but for the ledger's safety. An assistant shouted, and hands reached to steady the victim. In that pause, the clerk leaned forward, and the noble's hand tightened on his glove. The pause became an external event that shifted the pattern. The clerk used the break to stand on a box and raise the small ledger for anyone to see. He flipped the cover and drew a finger across the page to a matching ink mark. He tapped the line and spoke loud enough for the magistrate to hear, "Look." The mark matches other orders. The noble's face changed color behind his glove. The magistrate's hand tightened on the ledger at his side. Dread turned into a sharper question. Did the public sentence carry evidence of private complicity? The executioner watched the clerk and the noble exchange a single pointed look. The executioner had learned the cost of a glance in this job. He had always been the tool of names and sentences. Now the ledger tied those names to a sequence of similar orders. Doubt began to fray his steady hands. The assistant leaned in and hissed, "Bruno, the token," and then stopped when the magistrate's guard stepped forward. Bruno, the executioner, answered by tightening his grip on the saw. He had a name now in the crowd's murmurs, and the narrator noted it in the ledger of events. Bruno's jaw worked. The victim's eyes rolled white as the second swing began. The saw resumed its slow, cruel rhythm. The clerk pointed at the ledger and to the token, then looked at the noble speaking under his breath to a guard. The guard's stance shifted. The crowd's murmur became a low, anxious mutter. A private confrontation followed the new discovery. The noble slipped down from the gallery and pulled Bruno aside behind the scaffold, fingers at his coat. He spoke quickly, offering quiet reward and thin promises of protection if Bruno finished the act and kept silent about the ledger. "Finish it, Bruno," the noble said. "We will handle anything that leaks." Quiet is worth coin. Bruno stared at the noble's gloves. His palms had iron smears. He did not answer immediately. Bruno's hesitation grew into an argument of sorts, a negotiation done in two voices. You don't pay me for questions, Bruno, you pay me for work. The noble's reply was sharp. You are a tool, Bruno. Use your hands. Bruno looked at the ledger tucked beneath the magistrate's arm, and then at the token on the dirt. Doubt shifted into anger, then into a defensive calculation. He had daughters in a town 2 leagues away. He had supper to provide. The noble's promise dangled enough to force a choice. The assistant watched them and stepped close, fingers touching Bruno's sleeve. Bruno, the assistant whispered, the token. The noble cut him off with a look, and the assistant fell back. The clerk moved among the workmen, pointing to page entries and whispering details from previous orders. The name of a small hamlet where another saw sentence had been carried out months before. The crowd leaned toward the scaffold as if drawn by the clerk's rhythm of revelation. On the scaffold, the saw resumed. The second swing carried the teeth deeper, and the victim's body reacted with a convulsive roll. The executioner felt something give under his gloves, not just the timber, but a decision in his ribs. He pulled back for a breath and glanced at the magistrate. The magistrate's face had gone blank, a practiced mask. Nearby, the noble's lips formed a small, controlled instruction. The clerk stood balanced on his box and showed the ledger marks to a pair of guards. The guards exchanged a look and moved to intercept. A twist unspooled in the next instant. The victim, in a spasming reach, clutched the assistant's boot, and the carved token popped loose into the open. The token landed against the clerk's foot. A bystander knelt to fetch it. The clerk snatched it and compared the carved mark with the ledger entry. He held the token up and then, without ceremony, he lifted his own small ledger to the magistrate's face and read aloud a line that matched the token's symbol, and the name in the magistrate's ledger. The crowd's reaction sharpened to a gasp and a rising chorus of accusations. The noble barked the clerk's name and guards surged to seize the book. The magistrate's hand reached for his ledger and for the noble's sleeve simultaneously. The assistant took advantage of the movement and slipped from his knot-holding post. He scrambled to the scaffolding edge and fell toward Bruno's boots. Eyes wide and speaking low, Bruno, the clerk has it. He read it aloud. Bruno looked at the clerk and then at the magistrate. He made one move. He let the saw fall and stepped away. The act that had been meant to silence a token instead exposed the ledger's chain. The clerk, sensing protection in the momentary confusion, handed the token to a woman near the gallery who had a family connection to the victim. She raised it high and shouted the victim's name and house Renard. Voices clustered into a chorus demanding answers. The noble, realizing the scale of the revelation, barked orders and tried to turn the square into a controlled scene. The executioner used the cows to stagger off the dais. An order came from the magistrate for guards to seize the clerk. A short scuffle followed. 3 guards closed. A shoulder knocked the clerk's ledger out of his hands, and a guard's boot connected with the girl's wrist who held the token. Papers scattered across the stones. The noble retreated to the gallery with a tight calculation in his face. He ordered his attendants to gather the magistrate and leave at once. The assistant shoved past the crowd and vanished down a narrow alley. Bruno did not look back. He moved toward the alleys, the smell of tar and iron rising as he passed cart wheels and laddered ropes. The immediate fallout scattered into short, sharp incidents. The clerk's ledger was snatched and bundled under a guard's arm, but several loose pages fluttered into a merchant's stall and were picked up by a child. The noble's retinue hustled him away. The magistrate's ledger remained tucked beneath his arm, but his hand shook when he folded it. The workmen set down their tools and argued about whether to finish the day. The victim lay half, supported by ropes, and moaned. The executioner paused at the corner and let himself be swallowed by alleys and refuse. Dread resolved into flight. Bruno walked without stopping until the alleys opened onto the river. He leaned against a damp wall and breathed. His palms itched from the source leather. He thought of the noble's offer and the clerk's defiance. He thought of the assistant's sighs and of the victim's token. He had performed sentences for years without question. Today, a ledger had changed the calculus. Orders were not always neutral. Names could be shields for kin and influence. He felt then a shift from doubt into a brittle clarity. He would not return to the scaffold that morning. Back in the square, the magistrate called for an immediate tally. He tried to steady his voice and his hand. He barked orders for the captured clerk to be held in the guardhouse. The noble declared the crowd misinformed and insisted the sentence proceed. But the saw lay broken on the scaffold, a snapped tooth lodged in the flagstones. Word moved faster than the magistrate's commands. Merchants pointed. The child with loose pages ran toward the market, and several murmurs became an accusation that reached ears beyond the square. The magistrate's attempt to restore order hardened into damage control. An external event arrived every few breaths. A cart overturned nearby when two men collided. The woman who had been handed the token fainted and was carried off. A workman's shout rose when he found a ledger page stuck to a stall wall with ink marks identical to the magistrate's book. Each event pushed the square's mood from controlled spectacle to unruly inquiry. At dusk the scaffold stood empty. The victim had been carried off under guard to a small dark wagon. The clerk had been bound and led away, his ledger seized. The noble had left with the magistrate, both covered in a thin shell of public complaint. The executioner had disappeared into the alleys. The assistant had fled to a friend's house. The child had run off with the loose pages and handed them to a widow who kept her own ledger of debts. The token had gone missing in the bustle. The narrator catalogued the final measures with a clinical cadence. He recorded the snapped saw tooth lodged in the paving stone like evidence left behind, the ledger entries that matched carved symbols found in 3 other towns, and the affidavit the clerk had read aloud before he was seized. These were not metaphors, they were documents and bone fragments of an action intended to silence. The clerk's single loud sentence in the square had unspooled a network that could not be fully retracted. Bruno, later that night, stood at a river quay and watched barges take on coal. He felt none of the relief that the noble had promised. The coin felt like a lie now. A shift moved inside him from survival to a different calculation. He had opted for flight over complicity at the scaffold. He would not be safe in town, but the ledger's lines had been exposed enough to force them to act. He wrapped his leather gloves tighter and walked until the city's lights sputtered into a dark sprawl. In the days that followed, Magistrate Reynolds found his ledger challenged in 3 places. The clerk's loose pages circulated in the market and in 3 taverns. House Renard denied the connection publicly, issuing a curt statement that the victim had been a known troublemaker and that justice had been served. The executioner remained absent. Rumors tied Bruno to the alleys, but no one produced him. The assistant resurfaced in a different town, where he claimed he had a cousin to help with work. The woman who had held the token testified at a small gathering and swore she had seen the noble hand a sealed note to the magistrate. The chapter's small revelations escalated beyond the scaffold. The ledger entries enabled a clerk in a nearby manor to compare mark styles and produce a match to an earlier order. That clerk sent a sealed copy to a magistrate in the next town, who then demanded an inquiry. The noble's retinue began to fray under scrutiny. 2 attendants quietly left town, refusing to answer questions. The magistrate tried to summon the woman who had fainted, but she refused to return to the square and gave a statement through a neighbor instead. The public exposure multiplied into a chain of administrative checks. 3 weeks later, a governor dispatched a deputy to examine the seized ledger pages and the snapped saw tooth. They sent men to track down the child, who had run off with the papers. He identified the widow who had taken them. The widow carried the pages to a magistrate and pointed to the repeated mark. The deputy filed a formal complaint against the magistrate and House Renard. The complaint referenced the token, and the clerks allowed reading in the square. The accusation moved from rumor into official channels. Bruno watched the city from afar as officials wrote letters. He kept to the river at night and traded information for food at a punt. He heard the gossip move into proper hearings and watched a small group of men argue over the significance of a snapped tooth embedded in flagstone. The ledger pages had not been entirely seized. One folded sheet traveled from hand to hand until the deputy could produce it before an official hearing. The tooth was presented as an exhibit. The tooth, the deputy said in the hearing, tapping the flagstone sample, bears marks of repeated use on similar timbers. It came from that square. It came from a device used in multiple sentences. The magistrate's face went tight. He attempted to speak, then fell silent as papers were produced that matched his ink and a clerk's hand. The climax had come in the square when the clerk had raised his ledger and read aloud the mark tying the noble to other orders. That moment had forced the technology of punishment into the light and changed how power would be recorded in the courts. The public unmasking had not saved the victim. It had, however, seeded a ledger of exposure that legal men could pursue. The executioner had chosen flight and, by doing so, became a living witness to the failure of secrecy. At the hearing, the noble insisted on his innocence and requested witnesses. A rapid back and forth occurred between the deputy and the noble's counsel. "You have a ledger." The counsel demanded, "We have pages and marks." The deputy answered, "Where is Bruno the executioner?" The counsel pressed, "He is not needed," the deputy said. "The evidence stands in the ledger and in the crowd." The exchange lasted 5 lines and then collapsed into procedural motions. It exposed the noble's reliance on private orders and the public's new appetite for proof. The final closure did not come as dramatic revenge. It came as paperwork. The magistrate received a reprimand. 2 of the noble's attendants were charged with withholding evidence. The clerk, once released, testified against management practices that allowed orders to circulate without oversight. House Renard's influence waned in the immediate region. The victim's body was carried from the town in a shroud and buried where neighbors could add a stone and remember a name. The assistant found work on a distant farm and kept his mouth closed. Bruno took a boat out of the city at dusk and never returned. The scaffold remained in the square for the next market day. Men stepped over the snapped tooth. Children pointed at the place where the token had been shown and the ledger pages had fluttered. The narrator listed the concrete closes. The seized ledger pages that had traveled to 3 towns, the snapped tooth preserved in stone, the clerk's testimony recorded in a formal account, and the assistant's absence. These were measurable things. They resolved the mini-conflict. A spectacle intended to silence instead unmasked a chain of complicity. The last entry in the narrator's ledger for that day recorded the empty scaffold at dusk and a single snapped saw tooth lodged in the paving stones. The carved token, the assistant's ledger entry, and a scattering of seized papers had seeded inquiries. Power had tried to turn punishment into theater. The theater had cracked under the pressure of a small carved token and an outspoken clerk. Bruno's departure closed his arc. He chose survival and a different conscience over earning coin for silence. The magistrate's authority sustained a dent. The noble's name remained tarnished in neighboring towns. At the close, the square fell quiet. A workman swept sawdust into the gutter. A clerk picked up a loose page and tucked it into his coat. The narrator recorded these acts as final measures, not as metaphors. Broom bristles scraping, ink drying, ledger pages folded and stored. The day ended with the tangible evidence still in motion. The scaffold was empty. The tooth remained lodged in stone. Officials filed papers that would force a slow, bureaucratic reckoning. The final paragraph ends with a concrete beat. A deputy posted a small notice on the magistrate's door declaring an inquiry, and a messenger rode off to fetch the widow who had held the token. asking her to appear at first light.